Hey everyone, it's that time of year again. I'm recording this in January of 2025, and when a year ends, it's time for every movie geek to give their 10 best films of the year list. So how was 2024? Well, I thought it was a very strong year for movies, and I know that because I had a hard time whittling down my top 10 list, and sometimes there are years where I like a lot of movies, but whether I want to make something a top 10 becomes a struggle to get to that number. And then sometimes there are an abundance of riches, and I have a hard time whittling it down, and 2024 was like that. I wasn't expecting that because after 2023, when there was the SAG and the WGA strike, a lot of movies that were originally set to come out in 2024 were pushed to 2025, which is why if you look at 25 schedule, it kind of looks stacked. So I thought maybe, if all of these other projects are being pushed to 2025, then 2024 might be a dead zone, but that was not the case at all. There was a lot of really great stuff that came out this year. In 2024, personally for me, it was pretty good. Started off a little shaky, got better as it went along, ended pretty strong. So if you're wondering how the year treated me, pretty good. So, because I had a hard time whittling the list down to 10 films, I have a lot of honorable mentions, so I'm just going to spin through those. I mean, I say I'm going to spin through them quickly, and I probably won't, but these are in no particular order. Red Rooms. Red Rooms is a French-Canadian horror film that I blind bought from from Vinegar Syndrome, because one of their partner labels put it up, and it is a very well-made, cold, disturbing movie. And I say the word disturbing, and when people think disturbing, it's like, it's probably like really violent or whatever, but any of the violence takes place like off camera for the most part. It's not a violent movie. It's all about sort of what it says about the characters and the suggestions and that sort of thing. But that was a surprisingly great film, and that was released in the US in 2024. It may have come out in Canada earlier. Kinds of Kindness. This was the anthology film from Yorgos Lanthimos that he filmed before and after Poor Things, I believe. Has a great cast. It's pretty much if Yorgos Lanthimos made his own version of a Tales from the Crypt movie, where there's 3 segments and they're all about people who are being forced to make inexcusable sacrifices or kindnesses, and it sort of plays out like if Yorgos was making a horror anthology film, but filtered through his weird, dark sense of humor and all of that stuff. So if Poor Things and The Favorite and some of those movies were a bit closer to like normie-friendly Yorgos Lanthimos films, as normie-friendly as that director can get, or even The Lobster, Kinds of Kindness is definitely reaching a little bit more toward the Dogtooth type stuff that he used to do. Not as wild as that. But I really like it. It just barely missed the top 10 list. It's probably like 11 or 12 for me if I were to rank it. Honora was Sean Baker's new film, won the Palme d'Or. It's in a lot of Oscar contention talk. I got to see it in 35mm. It's the first movie my local Alamo Drafthouse has shown in 35. That's a new release since before COVID, when they showed Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and the original Joker. They still show 35mm films semi-regularly, but it's usually part of their like repertory screenings, Terror Tuesdays, Weird Wednesdays. They haven't shown a brand new release film in 35 in a while, so I was glad that I got one of the few 35 screenings of Honora they did. I liked Sean Baker's previous 2 films more than this. Red Rocket made my top 10 of the year it came out, and I later caught up with The Florida Project, and that's really good. I think Honora is not as good as those 2 movies, but it's still a great film. And what's funny is that most of the movie is a comedy, and a very funny comedy at that. And yet somehow the very last scene of the movie is the most gut-punching, wrenching, depressing thing that could come after 2 hours of sort of manic, anxiety-inducing humor that you could imagine. But it really hit me really well. Mikey Madison is terrific in it. So while I'm still rooting for someone else to win Best Actress, we'll talk about that later, Mikey Madison would be like my second choice pick, assuming she gets nominated, and she probably will. But Honora was great. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. Look, I'm a huge Ghostbusters fan. So I was probably going to like it as long as it wasn't complete shit like the 2016 version. And I actually like this one more than Afterlife. It felt a little closer to the first two Ghostbusters. It firmly established Ghostbusters 2 in canon, which I was very interested about, excited about. And it had a brand new villain as opposed to just recycling Gozer. It took place in New York again. It gave more time to the legacy characters, Dan Aykroyd and Ernie Hudson, who I met this year at a convention. Yeah, like if you're not a huge Ghostbusters fan, then I understand the problems with it. It's juggling too many characters that it doesn't need to. It's the structure and the pacing is a little weird. It definitely feels overstuffed. So I understand all of the normie complaints about it, and like as a non-Ghostbusters fan, if I can separate myself from my fandom, I see the flaws in it, which is why I didn't elevate it to the top 10. But as a pure Ghostbusters fan, it delivered what I wanted it to deliver for me, and I had a great time watching it, so that's why it's an honorable mention. Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. I guess the one thing two things holding Furiosa back is that one, it can't live up to Fury Road, which is a better film, and two is that there were some bad CGI backgrounds into the movie, whereas the CGI, when it was utilized within Fury Road, looked a lot better, and it seemed like more practical stuff was used in that one, even though a lot of practical was still used in Furiosa. Also, Fury Road is basically just a long car chase movie in two different directions, and Furiosa is this prequel that has like episodic and jumps through time, so it's not as like bullet firing out of a gun, but it's still a great movie, and it unfortunately did not do well at the box office, so we're probably not going to get the next Mad Max movie unless George Miller can pull a Megalopolis and raise the money for it. But Chris Hemsworth was great in it. Anya Taylor-Joy did a great job stepping into Charlize Theron's shoes. And I'm a sucker for post-apocalyptic narratives anyway. It's one of those genres where even if a movie weren't great in it, I would still be sort of inclined to like it. Post-apocalyptic movies, coming-of-age movies, there's certain like genres and subgenres that I'm gonna be inclined to like, and post-apocalyptic is one of them. But yeah, I like a lot of movie people. I really like Furiosa, but the normies just completely abandoned it. Abigail was the new Radio Silence movie. After directing two Scream movies, they sort of stepped back into something that felt a little closer to Ready or Not. The marketing ruined that it was a vampire movie, even though the film, as it unfolds, plays out more like that's supposed to be a mid-movie twist, or at least an after-first act twist. So Universal's marketing didn't do the film any favors. And I thought it was a super fun movie. It's a super fun vampire movie. Dan Stevens is really funny in it. Catherine Newton is great in it. And it was just kind of a throwback to like Fright Night type horror comedies and stuff like that. And it's very similar in tone to Ready or Not, and it also takes place largely in a mansion like Ready or Not did. So it's very much like the vampire Ready or Not, especially the geysers of blood and everything. I don't know why it didn't do better at the box office. Until Nosferatu came out later this year, vampire movies have just been bombing, despite the fact that Universal keeps greenlighting them, like Renfield and stuff. Universal was like, we're going to make a vampire movie every 3 months until one of them is a hit. Last Voyage of the Demeter also bombed, stuff like that. But Abigail, I thought, was just a pure, like, you want a fun studio horror comedy. This is, like, the pinnacle of what that type of movie can be nowadays. Rebel Ridge, Jeremy Saulnier came back roaring. After the 1-2 punch of Blue Ruin and Green Room. Green Room was my favorite movie of the year that came out. He made a Netflix movie called Hold the Dark, and that movie wasn't better because he chose to leave key information from the source material out of the movie, and the audience not knowing that key information can't engage with it as much. So I think he made a fatal creative mistake when he was making that movie in terms of the adapted screenplay there. But Rebel Ridge, yeah, it's nowhere near as good as Green Room or Blue Ruin, but it was definitely a return to the fold, much better than Hold the Dark was. And some people had complained that the main character in it doesn't kill enough cops or whatever, or it's not ACAB enough. But I thought it worked really well, and the fact that he's not just slaughtering cops left and right plays into, there's a story reason and a thematic reason for that. But it's basically this big anti-civil forfeiture movie, and if you watch John Oliver or whatever, you know civil forfeiture is basically where cops can legally steal your money because they consider it evidence of a crime, even if they don't accuse the person who owns that stuff the crime, and then people have to pay like huge legal fees to get their rightful property back. It's like an end run around the Fourth Amendment, and it's horrible, but you know, our corrupt and illegitimate Supreme Court allows cops to do it. So, but as far as a movie that's made about a clear societal problem like that, and it has certain throwbacks to First Blood, the first Rambo movie, and stuff like that. I think because it's standing in the shadow of better movies that director has made, I didn't quite like it enough to put it on the list, but it's definitely a high honorable mention. Casa Bonita, Mi Amor. This was the documentary about how the creators of South Park, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, mostly fueled by Trey Parker, bought the famous, if you're from Colorado, the famous restaurant Casa Bonita, which is sort of a fast casual Mexican restaurant mixed with a kitschy theme park. Like the Mexican Pavilion at Epcot kind of thing. They bought it out of bankruptcy, and they thought that it would only take a little bit of refurbishing, and they'd do some creative tweaks or whatever. And it turned out that the building was in way worse condition than they thought, and they sunk an absorbent amount of money into it solely for the purposes of like their own nostalgia. And it's a very interesting look at, well, one is that, instead of buying Twitter or trying to horribly influence U.S. government or whatever, what if people with a lot of money, because the South Park guys have like hundreds of millions of dollars from Comedy Central and Paramount to make South Park, what if they just wasted all of their money on a pet project like this, and it would be relatively harmless compared to what other like super rich people do in the world? But also, how much is your nostalgia worth to you? Is it worth $40 million for a business that is never going to turn a profit? And it's interesting because you definitely see watching the movie that they're not really trying to make the restaurant what it actually ever was empirically or ontologically. They're basically trying to turn it into their nostalgic memory of what their childhood selves thought it was. And it's an interesting look at how we react to nostalgia and how we react to the things that we loved as kids and the things we found as like safe and touchstones, and how we can often get lost trying to reclaim some of that in our more miserable, shitty adult lives. But I really liked it. And South Park, I loved it. It came out when I was a freshman in high school and whatever. And I love Cannibal the Musical and Orgasmo and some of the other movies those guys have done. But South Park itself, in latter years, has leaned a little too much into random bullshit libertarian politics for me to really like it. But it's still really nice to see Trey and Matt like jump into a creative comedic thing when they're doing the creatives of the restaurant that has nothing to do with their shitty libertarian politics. So as far as documentaries, it was a random surprise how much I enjoyed that, especially because I've been to Denver once, like over 10 years ago now, and I didn't go to Casa Bonita when I was there. So I have no personal connection. I really only know about it from that episode of South Park from like a decade and a half ago. So it was interesting to see how much this meant to like the community of Denver and to Trey Parker especially and the South Park guys, and what they were willing to throw into to fix something that they really should have just let die by all like logical standpoint, but their heart was in it too much. Terrifier 3. Terrifier 2 made my top 10 list of the year it came out, 2022, and I'm pretty sure that was skewed a little bit from the fact that the day I broke up with my ex-fiance was the day I saw that movie because it premiered that day. So I think I was tying my love of that movie into... Well, also I had met the director and the person who plays art at conventions and stuff before. So I think that definitely skewed my positive feelings toward Terrifier 2, though I still think it's a very good movie. Terrifier 3 I don't think is as good as 2. Even though 2 is a little overlong because they couldn't cut the Clown Cafe when they should have because a bunch of Kickstarter or Indiegogo backers were in that scene and they had to give them their money's worth and put their deaths completely full length in the movie. So Terrifier 3 is a little bit tighter. It's pacing-wise, it still needs some work. Damien Leone still needs to figure out pacing in the editing room. But it delivers all of the gore. It pushes the story and the lore of Art the Clown further. It has a nice little narrative about the Sienna main character and her trauma from the previous film. Plus, it's just a fun, Christmas slasher movie and everything too, and I really like the gore that pushes into the extreme stuff, and so I was really a fan of this. And if you want more of my thoughts about that movie a little bit, I did a live stream with Savedro back in October, right after that film came out. That discussion is not really about the film so much, but it is about sort of like its success as an unrated film and all of that stuff. So you can check that out, because I do have more thoughts on Terrifier 3 in that live stream on his channel. But otherwise, Terrifier 3 was way up there, and I collect a lot of Art the Clown merch, as most horror fans do, so it delivered the goods. Strange Darling. Strange Darling is one of the movies I had to slum to go at a Regal, because my local Alamo Drafthouse never got it. But Strange Darling was a really cool movie. It felt like a throwback to both 70s Grindhouse movies, and specifically the 90s Tarantino knockoffs that were emulating those. It has a non-linear narrative, which allows a narrative twist to take place. You'll probably see the twist coming, I did. But it's filmed in 35 millimeter, and I'm a cinema snob, where if a movie is shot on actual celluloid, on actual film versus shot digitally, 9 times out of 10 I'm going to think it looks better than if it's shot digital, and I'm going to give it a little extra breathing room in my rating for it. But Kyle Gallner is in it, and he's become this cult star of horror movies thanks to Red Letter Media and horror movie fangirls on Twitter. But he's great. The lead actress in that is great, and it definitely felt like it had some of that exploitation indie kitsch that we don't see in a lot of indie horror movies these days. And even then, Strange Darling isn't so much a horror movie as it is like a thriller type thing that just has some violence in it. But I felt very strongly that was a very good movie, and so it's an honorable mention as well. Conclave. Conclave, about the Catholic Church trying to vote on a new pope and whatever, is... I had heard some pretty good things about it coming out of, maybe it was Toronto Film Festival, or one of the film festivals that takes place around September-ish. And so I went to go see it in October. I had gone to see the mystery Alamo Drafthouse horror movie marathon of 4 movies, so I had already been at the theater for 8 hours. And I'm like, what's another 2? Let's tack that on and go see Conclave. And Conclave was really good, aside from having strong performances from the ensemble cast. What I liked about it is that it's not really a movie about religion. It's about electoral politics, and a lot of what happens in the movie is a microcosm of the general ideological fights that are happening worldwide now in different governments between a more progressive path forward into the future versus traditionalist or regressive factions, and how those are clashing to come up with who our leaders are going to be, what our policies are going to be, how we're going to interact with people outside of our own monkey zone. So I really liked how it took this microcosm of the conclave to pick a pope and used it as an exploration for just what the state of modern world politics are in 2024. I really enjoyed Conclave. And the last honorable mention is a Spanish horror film. Well, I wouldn't even call it a horror film. I would call it a extremely pitch black comedy. It's from Spain. I think it opened in Spain earlier, but it was released in the US in 2024. And it's called The Coffee Table. And this is a super, super dark comedy about something, I don't want to spoil it, so it's about something bad that happens involving a coffee table, and the slow motion disaster of one man attempting to hide what has happened, even though he knows and the audience knows that there is a finite amount of time that he can hide what has happened. And what happens is terrible and super dark, and you will feel guilty about laughing at all of the funny moments because It is really messed up that you're laughing at this, but it is just the balls to make a dark comedy about the event of this movie and to stretch it for the runtime of the film and expect your audience to laugh even as they are aghast is admirable. Like, not since a Serbian film, which I argue is a dark comedy masterpiece of anti-capitalist messaging, has a dark comedy had the potential to anger and rile up so many people. And both of those movies have superficial similarities. There's no sexual assault in The Coffee Table, but there's other similarities. And I'll leave it at that. Check out The Coffee Table. It's one of those movies I wouldn't recommend to everybody. So, if you're someone who can get really cool with really dark shit really quickly, check out The Coffee Table. Okay, and now this will be ranked my top 10 films in ascending order. Starting at number 10 is A Different Man. A Different Man is a film about a man with physical deformities. It's that, I forget the name, but it's the disease where you get like a lot of tumors that deform your face. And this is played by Sebastian Stan in heavy makeup. He is a person who is depressed and introverted, and he assumes that all of this, like the reason that women don't like him romantically, the reason he's not successful at his attempted profession of acting, is due to his condition. And so he undergoes an experimental procedure to correct that, and sooner rather than later, the procedure leads to those tumors falling off, and suddenly he looks like handsome actor Sebastian Stan. And yet, despite the fact that he looks more traditionally handsome on the outside and begins to have more success with the opposite sex of that time, it doesn't change who he is as a core person. And then he meets someone who still has the deformities, and it's played by the actor Adam Pearson, who does have this condition in real life. And that character is he is fun, and he is outgoing and extroverted, and people like him, and they enjoy spending time with him. And then suddenly the Sebastian Stan character is sort of the fact that he can no longer blame his condition on the way he is ends up causing great psychic damage to him. And this is another dark comedy about sort of internalized hatred, and it ended up just being a very powerful and poignant, between the laughs, look at people who think a problem is something external to them, and then having to face that the problem is internal, and their difficulty where they might not want to face it, because it's easy to shift the blame for, if something's bad in my life, then it's the way I look, or immigrants, or whatever. People blame a bunch of bullshit for stuff that's not really the problem. And then if you remove those obstacles, and the problems you have still remain, sometimes people can't accept that you yourself are the problem, and the movie is very much about that. Someone who has to face that the problem is him, and he cannot accept that, and it ruins him. And it also happens to be darkly, hilariously funny. And Sebastian Stan in the leading role, of all of the performances I've seen from all of the actors in movies in 2024, I do think Sebastian Stan in A Different Man is probably the best acting performance of the year, hands down, because he was also in The Apprentice in 2024, and you look at him playing Trump in that, and you see him in this. They're two completely different roles, and I've always said my bar for what makes a great actor is their range. You can have someone like Julia Roberts who plays the same role in every fucking movie and whatever, but someone who can play multiple different, extremely disparate roles and play them not just well, but to excel at them. That is the test of a great actor, and Sebastian Stan in A Different Man is doing things with that performance that just blew me away. Like, I've been impressed with a lot of his performances post-Marvel since, and things like Fresh and stuff like that. I even just saw him in that Apple movie Sharper, and it's not the best movie. It's fine, but he's really good in that, and I was just completely taken. So I mean, there's a lot of great performances this year. There's a lot of more great performances in movies I'll discuss after this. But Sebastian Stan, just his performance alone is more than enough reason to watch the movie. But the movie around him himself is also quite excellent. Number 9 is Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. I think the only reason this isn't higher on my list is just because the story is pretty well known. It's a surprisingly faithful adaptation of the 1920s Nosferatu. And it incorporates some elements from the Dracula novel as well. But cinematography-wise, this is a beautiful-looking, beautifully shot film with, like, candle lights, and they used actual film, so they're shooting in those low-light environments. But I really like that, every movie, no matter when it takes place, and this movie takes place in the 1830s in Germany, is always about the time in which it was made, rather than the time of the film. And so this movie, which is still reflecting a lot of story points from the original Nosferatu, as far as, like, a plague and all of that, it still feels very much like it is in conversation with 2024. In the original Nosferatu, that movie was made only a few years after the Spanish flu, so the scenes featuring the bubonic plague in that film were going to hit the audience a little close. Just as, a few years after COVID, this movie that also features a plague is also going to fit close. And there's different arguments about science versus superstition and nonsense, and that certainly comes up when you're talking about COVID. But still, the main theme about the movie, and it's what this movie brings to the subject material that is not particularly in the original Nosferatu too much, is this exploration of female sexuality and the way that male society denigrates that or attempts to suppress it. And a lot of this movie is about sort of the evil that comes about when you attempt to suppress something that cannot be suppressed, which is sort of the fuel of female horniness, for lack of a better term. And it does fit into the pattern where most of the horror films that came out in 2024 on a larger level, either studio horror films or the higher level indie stuff, were all dealing about women's issues of female sexuality or female reproduction, parenting of female children. That's obviously with the Dobbs decision and Roe v. Wade being overturned, a lot of films from American filmmakers were going to comment on that, because the horror genre has always commented on contemporaneous political issues. And this was just kind of one of the examples about that, about how we treat female sexuality as hysteria, or attempts to repress it or control it can only lead to a backlash. And so I really liked taking that sort of modern feminist theming, which is something Eggers has put in The Witch and some other stuff, and apply it to an otherwise very faithful adaptation of Nosferatu. Plus, it's just a gorgeous movie, and it looks fantastic. The sound design is immaculate. Score is great. On a horror level, it delivers the gothic moodiness and aesthetic. Willem Dafoe is great. All the performances are really great in it. I know some people don't like Aaron Taylor Johnson in it. I think he's fine. So yeah, I mean, if maybe there was some more interpolation of the story so that something more original happened on a surface narrative level, it would be a little higher up, because that's not where the invention is. The invention is in the theming and how he takes this material, and while still being faithful to it, still makes it very much a commentary on modern times and modern attitudes toward this sort of thing. Number 8 is I Saw the TV Glow. I saw the first movie from this director. It was called We're All Going to the World's Fair. And I hated that movie. I did not like that movie at all. But when I saw the trailers for I Saw the TV Glow, I'm like, okay, I didn't like their first movie, but maybe I'll like this movie because it might have a little bit more of a narrative. It certainly looks a lot more visually interesting than that movie was. And it got good reviews out of the festivals. I forget if it was at Sundance or whatever, but it was in some early year festivals. And so I go to see it, and At this point, I think everybody knows the movie is a trans allegory about being trans and the internal struggle of whether to transition or not. Unless you're completely oblivious or dense, I think most people are going to get that that's what the movie is about. So I'm not trans, so I didn't relate to the movie that way. But the narrative involves these characters who have very unhappy home lives for different reasons, and their escape is in their fandom of this TV series called The Pink Opaque, which is it has a lot of vibes of like Are You Afraid of the Dark, Goosebumps, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, sort of like 90s TV that definitely aimed at children and tweens and young teenagers in the 90s, which is, I grew up in the 90s, so that hit me home. Pete and Pete, Secret World of Alex Mack, it's commenting on, like, it's a hodgepodge of, like, all those kind of things. If you grew up in that era, you know this kind of stuff. And as someone who's on the spectrum, and whose most of my happy memories from my childhood are not from my real life, they're from the media I consumed, the movies and the TV shows, it struck a chord with me as far as someone who, plenty of people have had far worse childhoods than I have, but I still look back on my childhood as a time where I wasn't particularly happy, and I escaped through film and TV shows, and I definitely connected as an autistic person with a hyperfixation on films now. I definitely connected with the film's sort of secondary theming of that, and it emotionally affected me in a way I did not expect. Like, there's this great scene, even it's not technically a montage, but it fulfills the same purpose a montage normally would, where we follow the main character walking through the halls of their high school, and the song called Starburn and Unkissed is playing, which is a great song, and there's different like drawings and doodles around the screen that help tell some of the story, along with some voiceover and some stuff too. And nothing terribly sad is happening in that scene. Like, there's nothing in the story happening at that point that's sad, and all you're really watching is information coming to you while we track behind a character walking through hallways. And I'm watching the movie for the first time in the theater, and that scene was making me tear up. And at the time, I wasn't understanding why. And it ends up boiling down to the movie sort of reaching me at this weird emotional level that I was not expecting, and I even can't quite verbalize it in a way that I find adequate. But I connected not to the trans material, but I connected to the fictional narratives as something to obsess over, and as a life preserver, as a lifesaver for turmoil and unhappiness in someone's personal life. And so, even though I understand that is not the main point of the movie, that is the secondary point still landed with me very hard. And then on top of that, you put in that the movie has just very gorgeous, colorful visuals. Most of the lighting in the movie represents the colors on like the trans flag and stuff like that, so the visual metaphor is definitely surface level. I just found it weirdly emotionally moving, and if a movie is going to strongly emotionally affect me like that, I kind of have to call it one of the best movies of the year for me. So, some people have labeled it a horror movie. I wouldn't consider it a horror movie. I mean, maybe there's a certain yawning need or horror within the main character, but it's not a movie that I would, if somebody asks me to recommend them a horror movie, I'm not going to recommend I saw the TV Glow for that purpose, because when somebody asks for a horror movie, that's not the type of movie they're expecting to be delivered. Even if they want like an art house A24 movie, and this was released by A24, I don't consider it that. I guess I just kind of consider it a drama. But it strongly emotionally affected me, and that's why it's on the list here. Number 7 is Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 2. You know, in a day and age where we get a lot of blockbusters and big-budget wannabe blockbusters from the major studios, most of them are disposable Marvel movies and comic book stuff, and I liked Deadpool and Wolverine fine. I liked The Fall Guy fine, but we used to get mainstream blockbuster popcorn movies that were also artistic and were better than just stuff for the masses. If you look at like the blockbusters of the 80s or the 70s, your Jaws, your Star Wars, your Back to the Future, like those movies are fucking like high art compared to what like Disney is putting out today or any of the wannabe blockbusters of the modern era. And so Dune Part 2 is sort of the antidote to that, where, yeah, it's a big 4-quadrant sci-fi blockbuster filled to the brim with visual effects and taking place in a fantastical world and all of that. But it actually has, themes and something to say, and the artistry is actually good. Like I spend a lot of time in my reviews for various movies trashing the fact that computer visual effects these days look like garbage more and more. Like even movies that I like that will just have CGI slop ruining the frame. But occasionally we still get a movie that is packed to the gills with visual effects and they legitimately look great. The Avatar movies are on that list, and the 2 Dune movies so far are also on that list. Dune Part 2 is packed with, ornithopters and sandworms and a bunch of computer visual effects. As much as I love stop motion and old-fashioned matte paintings and all that stuff and miniatures, it uses state-of-the-art computer effects, but they actually look good here. And then Villeneuve also throws in stuff like that infrared shot arena scene so that it has its own visual style beyond that too. And Dune Part 2 just sort of felt like the best we can hope for nowadays for big budget Hollywood blockbusters. I liked Matt Reeves' The Batman, but we've seen a billion Batman narratives. Dune, we have the David Lynch one from the 80s, which I love because I love Lynch, but most people don't. And now there's a TV series, but the TV series wasn't very good. So we don't have as many live-action adaptations of the Dune universe, so we're not going to get sick of it like a million Batman or a million Supermen or something like that. And also, it's operating at a higher level than something like a Deadpool and Wolverine or something like that. It's talking about religion and how demagogues can manipulate people to their own advantage and true believers, and the politics of power and the manipulation of that, and a lot of just it's saying something about the state of demagoguery and the danger of following charismatic leaders to violent ends, and the things that are still very key to this day and age. I mean, and obviously, the lore of Dune is all based on, like the trusting AI and not and turning against that, because that takes place before the events of the Dune movies. So it's also built on this thing that we're currently fighting about now, this Gen AI bullshit. And I like that it had more in its head than the Marvel Ouroboros of eating itself through fan castings and self-referential jokes and things like that. And I can even like movies like that, I like some of the Marvel movies too, but, we used to have a higher bar for this type of movie, and I just wish that more mainstream blockbuster movies were at this level. Like, we'll get the Mission Impossible movies, and most of those are pretty good. But it still seems like we used to get Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back in the 70s and 80s. And now the best we can hope for is, like Revenge of Skywalker or whatever. We've lost so much of what that happened. And so now it's we're just not getting the same quality from Hollywood for the mega budgeted tentpole movies anymore. But Dune Part 2 still showed that we can get it if we let a turf filmmaker helm those things and have the creative freedom, as opposed to making movies by committee or by a producer's fiefdom. I don't know. Not the word I was looking for. So yeah, and then, just tie into that I just happen to really like the narrative of Dune. It's a story I find very interesting, and a lore and an alternate universe, like alternate history of the future that I find interesting. And I like that it has room for weirdness and aesthetics with like how they portray the Harkonnens and stuff like that. So yeah, Dune is sort of like the best we can hope for that type of movie in the near future, it seems. Which on the one hand is sad because we should have more options like we used to. But on the other hand, at least we're getting that. Number 6 is Memoir of a Snail. I was surprised by how much I loved this movie. Memoir of a Snail is a stop-motion animated film from like Australia, New Zealand, somewhere in Oceania, and it's rated R. And it ended up being, aside from the animation being beautiful, I'm a sucker for stop-motion and like claymation type stuff, so seeing that put into an adult narrative as opposed to James and the Giant Peach or something, no shade on that movie, but still, was pretty fantastic. Or an Armin movie, yeah. And the movie ended up telling a very powerful, poignant story about this this girl and her brother, and their father dies, and they're separated through foster care, and the trials and tribulations they go through in life. And it's like equally sad and funny, and the stop-motion claymation aesthetics of it are beautiful and yet sad and haunting, and it ended up just being one of the more affecting movies of the year, and I was not expecting it. This was a movie I went to see just because I'd started seeing this woman. I'm still seeing her, and we just needed a movie to go see together for like our second or third date or something like that. And I was like, oh, well, I've heard this movie has good notices. And then we go to see it, and I ended up kind of loving it. And I think it might be her favorite movie of the year, by the way. At least in her short review, she said she thinks it is. So that's another recommendation for whatever that's worth to you. But yeah, there were a few really good animated films this year. Flow was also great, and that's the movie that's kind of sweeping the award season right now. But Memoir of a Snail was my favorite of the ones I saw, and it's so excellent that it's fairly high on this list. And, if you had asked me at the beginning of the year, I had not even heard of this movie at the beginning of the year. So, yeah, check this one out. Number 5 is Blink Twice. And I feel like this is the movie that people are going to have the biggest question mark for me with, because everything else that's on this list I think will make a lot of other people's lists. Some may be in different positions, some might be in other people's honorable mentions versus their full list, but everything else I have on this list is kind of in conversation with different pockets of film fans and stuff like that. Blink Twice is the one I'm going out on the limb on and saying that it is one of the best films of the year and that everyone is sleeping on it. It's also the only movie I've seen in a theater that was preceded by a trigger warning, but I think that was because it opened like a week or two after It Ends With Us, and there was a lot of controversy over how that film was dealing with the domestic violence storyline within its marketing, and that's only gotten more contentious since with a bunch of lawsuits and stuff. But Blink Twice, it was written by Zoe Kravitz and another guy who she worked with on the High Fidelity TV series, which I've never watched, but I hear from friends is very good. I should probably check it out at some point. It's the first movie since Get Out that I feel deserves to be in the conversation with Get Out, where Get Out used a pretty fantastical thriller horror setup to make a commentary about a societal issue. In that one, Get Out was about bourgeois neoliberal racism, and Blink Twice is about toxic men and like the Me Too movement and things like that. But Blink Twice is about a woman and her friend who go to the private island getaway of a supposedly reformed tech bro who he apparently had a sex scandal with a former employee. He reformed his public image and was embraced back into modern society for some reason, and the main character has a crush on him. And so they get invited to his private island, which seems like it's just a 24/7 party and that they're having a great time with this billionaire who's doting attention on her. And then slowly but surely cracks start to emerge where things seem like they might be ominous in some way. And you'll probably be able to guess, it's not really a twist, it's more of a revelation. You'll probably be able to guess what the revelation is behind this. But I felt that the way that this film chose to tell its story and the way it unfolded and dealt with the very topical themes that it's talking about were next level writing. Like screenplay wise, this is one of the best sheer screenplays of the year was for Blink Twice. The screenplay was on that blacklist, the list of like the top unproduced spec screenplays of the year from a few years back. Before it was made. And, obviously if you think about like an island and that there's sex criminals on it, you're going to think about the Jeffrey Epstein thing. But also this movie came out like 1 month before all of the P. Diddy stories came out. And since Zoe Kravitz is the daughter of singer Lenny Kravitz, you do have to wonder if P. Diddy, being this music mogul, rumors were flying around and some of this movie was influenced by what she had heard secondhand about that kind of stuff. And I've seen some people complain about some of the fantastical elements of the movie, but my rebuttal to that is that people didn't really mind that Get Out had, like, hypnotism and brain swapping and a bunch of, like, absurd nonsense to tell its story. Nobody cared because it still worked within the realm of the story. And Blink Twice has some elements like that in terms of how the story goes. There's some fantastical stuff. And I think, much like the fantastical stuff in Get Out, I think it works for the universe of the movie. The one place I will be kind of on the same side with the people who didn't care for this movie as much as I did is that the very ending of the movie, the very last scene, doesn't quite strike the right note for me. I think perhaps Kravitz and her co-writer kind of wrote themselves against a brick wall, and that was the best they could come up with to end their story. But aside from that, which is like the only demerit I have on the movie, I thought this was a pretty excellent way of using fantastical elements in a thriller genre to discuss these very topical issues about men in power abusing their station in the dynamics with women, especially. So if you thought the reviews for Blink Twice were only lukewarm or the previews didn't do anything for you, I would encourage you to take a chance and watch this movie because I liked the trailer, but I was not expecting the movie to be great or to blow me away. And then I went to go see the movie, and I'm sitting in the theater, and as it unfolds, I'm like, I am surprisingly really loving this. And as the plot revelations go on and it goes through the machinations of the screenplay, I found myself very impressed with how the screenplay unfolds. I think it was a very tight screenplay that I think went through multiple drafts and edits to perfect before they ever rolled camera. Also, Channing Tatum is the billionaire in this movie, so he's your antagonist. And I believe they've broken up, but at the time he was engaged to Zoe Kravitz, and Channing Tatum probably gives his best performance ever in this movie. There's one scene where he repeats the line, "I'm sorry," over and over again in a more unhinged manner, and it's the best piece of acting from him I've ever seen, and it works within this film. It is like the polar opposite of Eddie Redmayne's horrible acting in that Good Nurse movie, where he's like, I can't. Channing Tatum in this movie is, I'm sorry, but his delivery and how it works within the tone of the movie works, whereas that movie is a laughable piece of shit. So if there's one movie from this list that you were unsure about and you want to, that I could encourage you to give a shot, even if you think it's not for you, make it blink twice. This is the one underdog of this list that I would really encourage you to take a chance on. And it was made by MGM Amazon, so if it's not on Prime now, it will be on Prime eventually, so check it out then. Forgive the quality change if you're noticing one here. The camcorder that I usually use to film my YouTube videos is not taking a charge anymore when I plug it into the charger. So I'm probably going to have to buy another one of those, so I'm resorting to my rear-facing cell phone camera for the rest of this video. Number 4 was Longlegs. I know that Longlegs was a big financial hit. It had a great marketing campaign, and so a lot of people went to go see it, and then some people were disappointed by it because part of the marketing campaign is like, oh, it's the scariest movie ever. And then when they weren't scared by it, they were like, it must suck. And I don't really get that attitude because no movie is scary, right? Unless you're a child. Like, I guess maybe they were expecting jump scares or like the bullshit you'd see in like a Conjuring movie for normies. But no, it's from Neon. It's an art house movie. That's not what it is. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm on the spectrum, or maybe it's because I watch a lot of horror movies anyway, but a horror movie being scary is not a criteria under which I judge whether it's good or not, because I don't find movies scary. Driving to the theater is more scary of an experience than any horror movie I could sit through. No, I'm looking for other things in horror movies. And the things that I usually look for, I found in Longlegs, which I thought was a very excellent way of merging supernatural stuff with the more traditional Silence of the Lambs or Seven type serial killer narrative. I also really love that the main character of Lee Harker, played by Micah Monroe, who is horror royalty to me because it follows one of my favorite horror movies, plays her main FBI agent character as kind of being on the spectrum. Like, apparently that wasn't her intention when she played it, and I'm not sure if director Osgood Perkins meant that to be part of the character. Maybe he just meant her to be like socially awkward in like a general neurotypical way. But when I was watching that movie, I just saw her as being on the spectrum, and as someone on the spectrum myself, I really dug that. And I thought it was one of the more realistic and positive depictions of that, minus the psychic powers they give her for the supernatural elements. But I really loved how that film unfolded, and like I was saying earlier, a lot of horror movies within 2024 were about female issues, about like procreation or female sexuality. And Longlegs, the main theme was particularly about sort of how parents can have a very restrictive view of their children or hold them too close in an attempt to protect them, and how that can backfire. And so it was part of the whole theming of like procreation and how parents deal with children, as well as religious elements, because there's both super Christianity and Satanism, or well, not Satanism in like real life, but like Satanism as in people who worship an actual physical Satan from the Judeo-Christian ethic or ethos. So that version of Satanism, not like the church or temple that exists in real life. So I like that it had that element to it as well. Plus, it's just an extremely well-made movie. You have flashbacks that take place in the 70s, and those were shot on film. And then the 90s stuff, which is the present of the movie, was shot on digital. It has a great look to it where it's kind of Fincher-esque in some ways, except that instead of leaning green like a lot of Fincher's movies do, this one leans very much into like the blacks and the reds, especially the reds. And so I really loved the visual look that they were going with, especially with Perkins hiding like a weird devil satanic figure in some shots that you don't really see until you watch the movie a second or a third time. But I just highly enjoyed this. And then, you know, when it comes to Nicolas Cage doing wacky roles, some people are really put off by that, and some people really dig it. And I am a Nicolas Cage fan, so I really liked what he did with Dale Cobble, or Longlegs, the serial killer in this movie. And I like the conception of that character as sort of a failed wannabe 70s rocker who ended up getting like a lot of bad plastic surgery and turned to devil worship and all of this stuff. And the unique, interesting method he uses toward killing, even though it's been compared to movies like Cure and some other stuff. So, yeah, I highly enjoyed Long Legs. Number 3 is the movie that I specifically waited a little longer to see before I made this list, and that is Brady Corbet's The Brutalist. I just had a feeling when I started reading notices of that movie coming out of, I think, TIFF was the film festival it premiered at, and reading what it was about, and some of the critics were talking vaguely about what the theming of the film was. And I was like, this seems like it's going to be up my alley. And so it finally opened at my local Alamo a few days ago, and I went to go see it. And yeah, I am in awe of the film. It is, within recent memory, it's one of the best films that I've seen that has really taken an axe to to this great lie of like America's greatness or American exceptionalism. And it really talks about how the difference between artists and producers or financiers and the compromises that artists have to make to please them, and how artists or how producers or financiers might go out of their way to appear as if they are benevolent when they are actually insidious. And how, at the end of the day, if those type of people could just do away with artists just so they could take all of the credit, they would, as we're kind of seeing with a lot of like tech bros getting into Gen AI and stuff like that. And obviously it's about an architect, but architecture is not really the subject of the movie. It's about sort of art in general, and you can certainly read onto the film as far as it being about this architect and the rich guy who's commissioning him for this building. You could definitely read a commentary on it as far as like Courbet being a director and having to deal with potential studios or financiers behind movies, and the little ways they chip away at your vision, and the struggle that it takes to still create art in the face of terrible times and the adversity of the world around you. And beyond that, it also speaks to like the immigrant experience in America, as well as the general racism and xenophobia that's built into the nature of the country, despite the country falsely claiming itself to be a melting pot. There's just a lot of really rich themes going on within the film, aside from it just telling a very captivating story across like an expanse of time from the late 40s to, well, there's a coda in the 80s, but mostly it's the late 40s to the early 60s. And it has these rich characters, and it's really involving. I mean, a lot of the ink being spilled over the movie are about that it's a very long movie. It's 3.5 hours, much like Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon the previous year, or The Irishman before that. But unlike both of those films, which normies got into a conniption fit because they don't like sitting through stuff, this one has an intermission at roughly the midway point of 15 minutes, so it's a little bit easier if you need to get up and pee or whatever. And then Courbet shot it on VistaVision, which is you put 35 millimeter through the camera horizontally rather than vertically, so it takes a better image and it doesn't distort large, and so I like that he was using that. Anytime you get some of these auteur directors to dust off old analog film techniques, like Ultra Panavision for Hateful Eight, like Tarantino did a few years back, and stuff like that, or Nolan embracing 70 millimeter via IMAX for a lot of his movies. I really like when they dust some of this stuff off. And VistaVision, Hitchcock used it for some of his best color films, North by Northwest and Vertigo and stuff. So I really like that he used that. And the film has a very, even though it's truly an epic, like on the level of something like Reds from Warren Beatty, or something like Once Upon a Time in America from Sergio Leone. It still has a very narrow focus on the characters, even as it is telling sort of this grand story about the lie of America and the parasitic nature of capital on art. And the performances are all magnificent. Brody, Guy Pearce, Felicity Jones are excellent in the film. The score is probably the third best score of the movie, third best score of any movie I've seen in 2024. The first and second will be, oddly enough, the next two films I'll discuss here. But I just truly like. It's been only a couple days since I've seen it, so I feel like I'm still digesting a lot of what it's saying and all of that. But as far as the experience I had, it absolutely deserves to be this high on my list. And it's one of the few times where I've seen a film like this long, and I'm like, I really can't wait to revisit it. It's like perfectly paced, even though it's not. It's neither too fast nor too slow. It moves at a great speed for itself, and I was never bored. I was always like enraptured by this film. I absolutely loved it. So go see The Brutalist when it finally opens near you. Number 2 is Luca Guadagnino's Challengers. I saw this movie early in the year because it opened around like April or something. It was pushed back due to the strike. It was supposed to open in the last quarter of 2023. And the early release of the year probably hurt its Oscar chances because it's not really in the conversation except for maybe score and best original song. The best original song was my number 1 most listened to song of the year on Spotify Wrapped, by the way. I don't know if it's probably going to lose to one of the Emilia Perez songs at the Oscars if it does get nominated, but it's one of the few times I loved a closing credit song so much that I sat through the entirety of the credits to hear it, especially because I didn't know there was going to be a song sung by Trent Reznor in the movie before I went to go see it. And it certainly, hands down, has the best original score of any film this year. Obviously, Reznor and Ross, they've done a great job with their score, especially with the David Fincher films, and they've done some other stuff. But yeah, they really hit it out of the park for this particular movie. And Luca Guadagnino's, I finally watched most of his filmography this year. I filled in the gaps that I had missed with like Bigger Splash and I Am Love. I still haven't seen his first 2 films. And I saw Queer later in the year. But this is, to me, his best film and the one I enjoyed the most. And, a lot of people took different things from the movie. For one, it's a sports movie, and 9 times out of 10, almost 10 times out of 10, you go into a sports movie and you know how the main sporting event is going to end. This is one of the few times I've gone to see a sports movie and I literally did not know where they were going to go with the final match, who was going to win and how they were going to do that. So it's one of the few times I've felt actual suspense during the final game of a sports movie. But a lot of people looked at it in like a polyamory angle, and some people looked at it in a queer angle. But to me, a lot of the movie was sort of about the gamification of emotion and the gamification of love and the negative aspects of what happens when you take a deeply emotional feeling like romantic and sexual love and you turn it into a competition, you turn it into a game. And I really liked how that plays out between these 3 main characters, where you have the Zendaya character, Tashi, who she loses her chance to become a star, and so she ends up funneling that vicariously through the character of Art, who she ends up marrying. But Art knows that their love is really, he loves her, but she doesn't really love him. Her connection to him is predicated on how successful he is and how much she can live through him. And he knows that, and it scares him because like the minute he wants to retire, he thinks she's going to leave him. And then meanwhile, there was his best friend who was the first to date Tashi, and he's the more overtly bi or pansexual of the 2, and he has hard feelings over everything that went down, but Tashi also feels a love-hate attraction to him, and I just really love how it focused on love as competition, which is not a theme you see really delved into much, even though there are plenty of love movies about triangles or, whether one character can like win the heart of another. I mean, half of the YA movies after Twilight were about that. But I've never seen a film really delve into what it means to turn love into a game before like that. And then beyond that, it's just visually, dazzling and magnificent, turning, the camera into the POV of a tennis ball, and the excitement that the score and the editing works for that film. I was just super blown away by the movie, and its quality of that movie has stuck with me for the majority of the year. And so that's why I'm rating it so high on this. The only reason I don't own it on physical media is because Amazon MGM won't fucking put it out on a 4K UHD yet. And they put it out on a Blu-ray that had barely any extras. So I'm hoping there'll be a special edition on the road at some point. But I really love Challengers, and that's why it's so high on this list. It's number 2. And the number 1 best film of 2024, according to my opinion, will be no surprise or shock to anyone who follows me on social media, but it is Coralie Farge's The Substance. I heard about this movie coming out of the Cannes Film Festival back in May. It won Best Screenplay there. I was hearing that it had some body horror elements, and David Cronenberg is one of my three favorite directors. Even though the film itself isn't very Cronenbergian, it's a lot. Hi, Carl. It's a lot closer to something like Frank Henenlotter or Brian Usna, Society, especially. But that really perked my interest, and I had seen Coralie Farge's first film, Revenge, when it hit Shudder years ago, and I really liked that. But I finally saw The Substance in September, and I loved it. It's one of the few times that I burst into applause as soon as the credits started. It's also the only new film of 2024 that I saw more than once in the theater. I saw it twice. And I don't see I don't see new movies repeatedly in the theater very often. And I burst into applause that second time too, though the first time some people followed me and the second time they didn't. But I loved The Substance. Aside from the general body horror elements and the super great horror finale of it, I love the completely audacious, in-your-face style of the film, where the film is not in any way, shape, or form meant to be taken on a literal level, which is why there's people who are like, oh, but Sue doesn't have a last name or social security number. Fuck you, it doesn't matter. You're not meant to take the movie literally. Yes, it snows in LA in the movie. Who cares? That's not the point. And I just found that the whole theming about internalized misogyny and how that internalized misogyny is caused and reinforced by external male attention, not just within the entertainment community, but just in whole. And then there's also a male character who takes the substance. So it's not primarily about just misogyny, but that's the central part of the film, and how you can be caused to hate yourself even if there's nothing wrong with you because of the expectations, either male gazy sexual expectations or economic expectations from the industry they are in, and standards of beauty, things of that nature. I really liked how it wove in those themes with this very visually thrilling film that takes like visual cues from everyone from Kubrick to Lynch and all of these other ways that Farge is creating this very stylized world. Especially with like the production design, that like red and white bathroom that kind of looks like The Shining, and this very like fisheye lens close-ups of Dennis Quaid eating shrimp grossly and all of that, and the very exuberant emotive nature of the acting, the very like sharp satirical humor mixed in with this sort of just boundless energy that the film has. The film, even The Substance, is almost 2.5 hours, and it doesn't feel it. It goes by like whip fast. Both times that I saw it. Demi Moore, as of this recording, seems to be the front runner for Best Actress, which is shocking because, as we all know, the Academy doesn't like to award genre films that often, though they've been getting better in its semi-recent history. I mean, they gave Shape of Water Best Picture, they gave Parasite Best Picture, so, they gave Get Out Best Original Screenplay, so we're making some progress there if you're a horror lover who wants to see, actual horror art awarded during, mainstream award season and not just like the Fangoria the Dead Meat Awards or something like that. The score by Rafferty is great. I've been listening to that a lot. I was just super, super impressed by this movie. And, I've seen a few detractors from the film. I believe like Flynn Slicker, who like runs the social media for Letterboxd, she originally gave it like 1.5 stars on Letterboxd and said like she was offended, and then she deleted that when people started liking it. But I think most of the negative notices to the film are because they would disagree with how the film treats the Demi Moore character, Elizabeth Sparkle. Some people have been reading the film as it looking down on that character or judging her. But I think the film empathizes with her. I don't think it's judging or denigrating Sparkle at all. And then you have Margaret Qualley, who, she's quickly becoming one of my favorite actresses. When you look at, look what she was doing in Kinds of Kindness this year, or Drive Away Dolls. A lot of people didn't like that movie, but I liked it. And she was obviously great in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Tarantino's film. So she's really building up quite a strong filmography for herself. And it's actually been very nice to see that she's been getting some supporting actress nominations at like critics groups and Golden Globes and stuff like that along the way, because I can see a lot of shallow people viewing the movie and thinking like, oh, she's just there because, she agreed to like close-ups of her ass a lot, but she's actually doing some great comedic work in that. And I even though Demi Moore deserves all of the accolades she's getting for her performance, Qualley shouldn't be slept on either. And as much as we don't particularly like Dennis Quaid nowadays because he's a right-wing asshat, he's quite good with his comic timing in this movie and stuff. So even though we all prefer his son Jack nowadays, Jack Quaid is great. Dennis Quaid deserves his accolades for this film, especially because he stepped in after Ray Liotta passed away because he was originally cast in the role. But Dennis Quaid, I don't know whether he understood the assignment, but he did very well on the assignment. So yeah, it's not a unique or out of the box pick for my number one film of the year, because a lot of people love The Substance. It had the best legs at the box office of like any film this year. It made like 5 times its opening weekend once it opened wide. But yeah, I truly love this movie, and it is my pick for the number one best film of 2024. Well, and that's it, everybody. So thanks for watching this top 10 list. I hope that the final 4 of my list were shot okay on the cell phone. The front-facing camera is not that good on my cell phone, but the rear-facing camera is pretty decent, so that's why I'm using that. So I can't see what I look like right now. I don't even know if I'm in focus. So I hope that's all right. But the first movie I saw in the theater of 2025 was The Brutalist, so I haven't seen any new 2025 movies yet. First one is probably going to be Den of Thieves 2, I guess. So we'll see how 2025 is going to go. It's a pretty densely packed year of releases because a lot of stuff was pushed back from the strikes, as I mentioned. So we'll see how it goes. But 2024 was a very strong year, and I'm following awards season. I absolutely fucking hated Wicked, so I hate that that's racking up nominations and will probably win Ensemble at SAG. I saw Emilia Perez. I didn't hate it as much as other people did, but I didn't exactly love it either. It's still better than Wicked, but I don't want to see Emilia Perez win Best Picture either. Of the movies that have an actual shot of winning, with like Brutalist and Anora and Conclave, movies that have all made my either my top or my honorable mention, I guess I'm rooting for The Brutalist of those, because The Substance will probably eke in a nomination of 10, but I don't think it's going to carry its way to Best Picture, unfortunately. So I guess I'm rooting for The Brutalist, but we'll see how this award season goes. There were some devastating fires in LA, so it's pushed back a lot of dates for like Critics' Choice and some other stuff. So we'll see how it goes. But if you happen to be a member of the Academy and are watching this, give The Substance and Challengers some love, give The Brutalist some love, and if you can slip in a nomination for original screenplay for Blink Twice, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks. But otherwise, have a good day, everybody, and we'll see what other videos I make in 2025 once I replace my camcorder.